This video is for Concept 1 notes for Principles of Natural Selection. We're only going to go through the first 9 slides and then get started on homework for today. All right, what is evolution exactly? So the definition for evolution is just the process of change in populations over time that makes the offspring different from their parents. It could be the offspring from one generation being different from their parents, or the offsprings after many generations being different from their more distant relatives or ancestors. So evolution can be on a very small scale or it can be on a very big scale, and we're going to talk about both kinds of those. So the one that's on a small scale is microevolution. It just changes things within a population. It doesn't cause new species to be created. This would be if you need to get a flu shot every year because that flu virus has mutated and changed from year to year. That's why they're asking you to get a flu shot every year, because that population of flu viruses has actually evolved over time, over just 1 year. And then on a large scale, is called macroevolution. So this is across many populations, or the creation of new species, which is also called speciation. So part of your assignment, your homework assignment, was to get together in a team of 2 or 3 and to make a 1-page poster about what was believed before. We're going to put those up so that you can get an idea of what all of the other ones were, but briefly we're going to go through each one. So Aristotle basically said that organisms become more and more complex. So we had this hierarchy of complexity from very simple organisms to humans, which he thought was the top of complexity. Creationism believes that the earth is very young, about 6,000 years old. That is based on biblical evidence, and that God created organisms to be perfectly adapted to their specific environments. Catastrophism was developed by George Cuvier. He basically said that there was big events on the earth that caused big changes. So you can think of something like the idea of the meteor maybe wiping out the dinosaurs and many other living things at the time. That would be an example of catastrophism. It would cause big changes in the living things on the planet. Gradualism was by Hutton. He basically said instead of these really big changes happening, it would be slow, small changes that would be happening over and over and over again that would eventually become a big change. Thomas Malthus came up with the idea that living things compete with each other. There's way more offspring or organisms in a population that can possibly survive. So some of them aren't going to survive. So only the best ones are going to be able to survive. Uniformitarianism is by Charles Lyell. He basically said that the processes that we see on our planet right now are the same ones that have always been happening on the planet, and they haven't changed. So if we notice these small changes happening in these few generations, imagine the big changes that can happen over many, many generations. The inheritance of acquired traits or characteristics was by Lamarck. He basically said that this giraffe in the tree is going to keep stretching its neck up so that it can reach the leaves higher and higher in the tree, and it will pass on that stretched neck trait to its offspring. We know that that's actually a false theory because there's no way that a giraffe can actually stretch its neck up higher and higher. It can't change its genetic code just because it wants to reach the leaves higher in the tree. Intelligent design says that all of these processes and beings are too complex to happen by chance or by random mutations. There has to be a creator or designer. And I don't think we have Linnaeus in here. That was one of the other posters. Carolus Linnaeus came up with a system of taxonomy based on the ideas of complexity. So the organisms that seem to share some of the same traits must be grouped together. So we'll talk more about that, but basically he has hierarchies of relatedness. So all of the invertebrates are in a group, all the vertebrates are in a group, all of the canines are in a group, all the felines are in a group. And then they get smaller and smaller groups until you get down to the species level. And then there's Darwin. Remember, Darwin didn't come up with the idea of evolution. He did come up with a way that evolution can happen, or a mechanism that could cause change over time. He was from England. He was a naturalist. That means he studied the natural world. He went on this trip to the Galapagos Island as the ship's naturalist. When he was on his trip, he saw that there was different species of things that lived on the islands, and they were different from island to island. They were specifically adapted for each island. So those traits were perfectly suited for them and that island that they were on. His idea is called natural selection, which is the process or the tool of how evolution could actually happen. How could that change in population actually happen? So natural selection basically just means that the organisms that are the best adapted, they have the best traits. They're going to live longer because they're going to get the most food. They're going to be able to escape predators. They're going to have the best traits to make them live longer. And not only that, but they're also going to reproduce more than the others, because there's certain traits that might not help you live longer, but they might help you reproduce more. So if you think about birds that are really colorful, that color isn't really there sometimes to help them escape from predators or to anything else really, except for reproduction. They just want to look better than the other birds so that they can attract more mates. And because these organisms live longer and they reproduce more often, they are more likely to pass those traits on to the next generation. So they're going to eventually cause changes in the whole population because those traits that they have are going to be passed on. This is also called survival of the fittest. Fitness being a measure of how well you are adapted to your specific environment. One thing that's really important to remember about natural selection is that it's very specific to each environment. An organism that's really well adapted or really fit in one environment is not going to be as fit in another environment. I mean, humans are not very fit for living in water, but dolphins are. And we're both mammals that have a lot of traits in common. So that's a silly example, but you get the idea. Okay, so there's 4 main ideas of natural selection, and we're going to talk about each one of those. The first one is overproduction of offspring. This kind of goes back to the idea that we're always going to have more offspring than are possibly going to survive. So I always imagine the sea turtles that have all of these tiny little baby sea turtles. And you know that when you're watching those little baby turtles crawl across the sand, that not very many of them are even going to make it to the water. Those of them that do are going to get eaten by predators pretty quick. The ones that are, slower or, they just can't swim as fast. They might not be as camouflaged. They're not going to survive. So there's a lot of offspring. So the sea turtles have this process of making way more babies because they want to make sure that at least some of them are going to survive until adulthood. Also know that every ecosystem has limited resources. There's just not enough things to go around. That causes competition. So you could think about those Galapagos finches that went through the drought, and they had a limited supply of those small seeds, and so they were competing for those. Only some of the birds got those small seeds. The ones that were also able to eat the large seeds were better adapted for that environment because they were able to take advantage of a food source that the other ones couldn't. So when you think about competition, sometimes it's not always fighting. Sometimes it's just, I got there first, or I was able to swim away from the predator and you weren't. There's lots of reasons why that competition might happen. The next one, variation. All individuals are different from every other individual in the population, especially organisms that use sexual reproduction. Because during meiosis, that crossing over happens, it mixes up the traits. You're not identical to any of your siblings unless you are an identical twin because of variation. So there's differences in the traits that we have. One source of variation is just random mutations. This is how new traits, brand new traits, are introduced into a population. So this is one example of how variation can happen. Another one, like I said, is that crossing over during meiosis. You're just mixing up the genes and getting different combinations. And then the last one is migration. So organisms can move into or out of a population, and that is also known as gene flow. So if you have a group of new birds that come in and they have bigger beaks than every other bird, they're bringing those new genes into that population. And as long as they can reproduce with those other birds, they're going to start mixing up that trait and getting it into that population. The next one, adaptation. Adaptations basically just means you have something cool that's going to help you survive in your environment. Maybe you have spikes, maybe you have horns, maybe you're a certain color that helps you camouflage, something that helps you survive. These are beneficial traits. They become more common over time because the organisms that have them are going to be able to live longer and reproduce more. This changes the gene pool, even if it's a little bit by a little bit every generation. Eventually, it could cause big changes in the population. The gene pool is just all of the alleles possible in a population. So if you think about mixing up every single possible combination of alleles for a specific trait, that's the gene pool. All right, the last one, descent with modification. Basically, what's going to happen is that because of all of those other traits, there's going to be a change in the frequency of genes over time. So just like in the finches, where that 8.8 millimeter beak, it was kind of in the middle and it was the most popular beak size for the finches. After just one generation, it changed to the 9.8 millimeter beak being more popular or common. That's a change in gene frequency, and that is evolution. Natural selection is going to lead to the populations with new phenotypes adapted to new situations. So something to kind of remember is that nature doesn't care what your genes are, it cares what your traits are. So it's not acting on your genes necessarily, it's acting on your phenotypes or your actual physical characteristics. So it doesn't care whether you're homozygous or heterozygous or any of those specific combinations. As long as you can survive in that environment, you're going to survive. Remembering that traits come from our parents and our parents' parents and our ancestors going way back. Beneficial traits really should become more common over time. That's something that is pretty easy to understand. Remember, individuals can't evolve, only populations do. So that gene pool changes over time, but an individual's DNA doesn't change. All right, for homework, let me make sure. Yep, we're ready for homework. Let me grab homework so that we can talk it through. All right, you have 2 pages for homework. Read the scenario, explain how natural selection could occur in each, using the 4 principles of natural selection. So we have overproduction of offspring, adaptation, variation, and descent with modification, as well as what conditions drive natural selection. So your job is to read the scenario for each organism and then talk about how natural selection could occur. All right, so let's look at the worm one, see if we can come up with some ideas to get started. Some worms eat at night and some worms eat during the day. Most birds only eat during the day, so they're only eating the worms that are awake during the day. Those are called diurnal worms, because those nocturnal worms are burrowing down and sleeping. Each spring when the worms reproduce, about 500 offspring are born, but only 100 of them live long enough to reproduce themselves. So looking at all of the choices, overproduction of offspring, adaptation, variation, and descent with modification, tell me what's going on here, which one of those principles is it acting on, and how will the population change over time? So how would natural selection actually occur? All right, feel free to send me a message or an email if you have any questions.